Okay, so here we go with video number 5, I think. This one is on equilibrium in the ADAS model. So that's the name of what we're doing right now, the ADAS model, and it's the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. So first off, a note on what the author is doing with the aggregate supply curve. Note that he draws it as a curve. Price level and GDP, okay? So the author is drawing the AS curve as an actual curve where the slope is rather low in this portion here, saying that at low levels of GDP, when there is an increase in spending in the economy, price level does not go up very rapidly. At some point, we get into what's called the intermediate area, where price level starts rising more rapidly with increases in spending, aggregate spending down here. And then at some point, we get tremendous increases in prices if there's any more spending. Inflation skyrockets. So this is a pretty standard way to draw the graph in a college level class. The AP exam is going to expect us simply to draw a straight line aggregate supply curve, and that's what I'm going to stick to most of the time. So we're just going to do that intermediate range aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply curve as a straight line. Aggregate demand, of course, is downward sloping, and where the two meet, we get equilibrium. If the nation is operating at full employment where it should be, that equilibrium is also the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, now that long run aggregate supply curve establishes, and that equilibrium point establish the equilibrium level of GDP. Your book has been labeling this with a Q. We're going to label it with a Y because that's what the AP exam is going to be doing. Okay, please don't be confused. The book labels it Q, full employment. We're going to call it income level Y, FE, full employment. A note on that level of full employment is potential GDP. Remember, a couple of chapters ago, we had the graph of potential GDP and actual GDP, and we talked about GDP gaps whenever the business cycle was below potential GDP and the country was in either slow growth or possibly even a recession. And then we had periods where actual GDP was above potential GDP, and that's when the economy was experiencing typically some inflation. So we'll be talking more about that using this model here in just a second, but why full employment is potential GDP. All right, now changes in aggregate demand. That's what this video is about, changes in aggregate demand. If aggregate demand shifts to the right for some reason, because either the government is spending extra money, Congress decides to spend a lot more, we go into war and there's a lot of spending because of a war situation, or we're fighting some other issue like the coronavirus right now, government's going to spend a lot more money. So aggregate demand could shift to the right because of government spending. It could shift to the right because consumers have high confidence. They're excited about the economy and they're going out and spending more money. Businessmen may look at the economy and think that it's going gangbusters. Let's pump up investment spending. And of course, foreign sector could pump up spending. One way or another, aggregate demand could shift to the right. Okay, we'll call this aggregate demand sub-zero and this aggregate demand 1 shifting to the right. This is classic demand pull inflation. People are spending more because they're excited about it, whether it's consumers or government or businessmen or foreigners. And we wind up at a new equilibrium at a higher price level. Okay, now that can't last very long because we're beyond full employment. We're beyond potential employment. It can last for a certain period of time. Eventually, input prices are going to start rising, and we're going to shift back to the long-run aggregate supply curve. probably at a significantly higher price level. Here was PL1, and I'm using PL instead of P. The book just uses P. PL1, that was initial equilibrium. We got demand pull inflation. We went to price level 2. Then input prices started to increase, and we went all the way up here to price level 3. PL2 and PL3. Okay, we got wound up with a significant amount of inflation. Now, point one more thing out here. The aggregate demand curve shifted to the right by that much. The horizontal shift was from here to here. Okay, that is the full multiplier effect. That would have been the full multiplier effect, that horizontal shift of the aggregate demand. We wound up with less than the full multiplier effect. We actually wound up temporarily at this point, Y prime we'll call it, which was a little bit of inflation. Input prices were rising, output prices were rising, and we wound up with some inflation, and that took away from the full multiplier effect, okay? And so that's what your book talked about. There's both an output effect and a price level effect there. And then input prices rose, and we moved back to this higher price level here. So that would be an expansion. Now, this video is getting a little bit long, but that's okay. We'll try to wrap this up quickly. What if we go into recession? What happens when people stop spending money? And that's exactly what's happening today. This past couple of weeks, people are staying home because of the coronavirus fears. You're not coming to school. You're not spending as much money on gasoline. People are not going to restaurants. Restaurants are closing. A lot of retail stores are closing. And so much less is being spent. Aggregate demand is shifting back that way. And there's a full multiplier effect going on right now. We're getting, not only am I not going out to dinner with my wife, but the people at the restaurant aren't getting my money. They're not spending their money on whatever they would have spent my money on. So the full multiplier effect is going on right now. And we're falling back. We'll call this AD2 and moving into what we're going to be seeing as a recession. Eventually, input prices are going to fall. People are going to lose their jobs. They're looking for jobs. They're going to be willing to take lower wages. People who have resources, nobody's buying the resources. They want to sell them. They're willing to sell them at lower wages. And eventually, we're going to see a decline in the price level, possibly. We could conceivably come all the way back to here. But that's way down the road, okay? That's going to take 6 months, a year, maybe year and a half, 2 years for that to happen. What actually happens is what your book calls the ratchet effect. Whenever aggregate demand shifts to the left, we don't go down here. We don't go to that place. We come here, okay? And we typically get the full multiplier effect in reverse, the negative multiplier effect, and your book calls that the ratchet effect. Once we are in this situation, we typically need some kind of investment in the economy by the government or somewhere to get the economy back on track. Classical economists and conservative economists would say, leave everything alone. The government shouldn't step in. Eventually, prices will fall and people will be rehired and we'll move back to full employment. Keynesian economists or mainstream economists nowadays would say, no, we're going to need some kind of a stimulus package. And that's what Congress is going to be working on in the near future here. So that's the end of this video. In the next video, I'll go into changes in aggregate supply.